You finally have a free evening. Nothing on the calendar. No one needs anything from you. You sit down on the couch, and for about 45 seconds, it feels like relief. Then something shifts. A strange discomfort starts creeping in. At first, you can't even name it. It's just this low-grade tension, like you've forgotten something important, like there's somewhere you're supposed to be. Your eyes drift to the laundry basket in the corner. You remember the email you haven't answered. You think about how you really should be using this time to meal prep or exercise or learn something, or at least do something that counts as self-improvement. Your body is on the couch, but your mind is making a list of all the ways you're wasting this moment. Maybe you start scrolling through your phone, looking at other people's accomplishments. Maybe you get up and start tidying even though you just cleaned yesterday. Maybe you turn on a podcast, something educational, so at least you're learning while you're not doing anything, because just sitting there feels impossible. You pick up your phone, not because you want to, but because sitting still without doing anything feels physically uncomfortable, like an itch you can't scratch, like something is wrong and you need to fix it, except the thing that feels wrong is simply the absence of productivity. You might even have techniques to justify the busyness. This isn't procrastination, you tell yourself. It's being responsible. This isn't anxiety, it's ambition. This isn't avoidance, it's just how successful people operate. And underneath all of that, so quiet you might not even notice it, is a voice. It says things like, "You don't deserve to rest yet. You haven't done enough today. What kind of person just sits here doing nothing?" Sometimes the voice gets specific. It reminds you of the project you haven't finished, the weight you haven't lost, the savings account that isn't big enough, the career milestone you haven't reached, the better version of yourself that exists somewhere in the future, the one who has earned the right to rest, except that version keeps receding as you get closer to it. If this sounds familiar, I need you to know something before we go any further. This is not a character flaw. This is not laziness in reverse. This is not some twisted form of ambition or a sign that you just care more than other people. This is a pattern that was learned. It has roots that go deeper than you might expect. And it can be unlearned, though probably not the way you think. Because here's what nobody told you. The inability to rest without guilt isn't a mindset problem you can fix with the right productivity hack or morning routine. It's not about finding better boundaries or learning to say no more often, although those things might help on the surface. What's actually happening lives in your nervous system. It was shaped in your earliest relationships, and it's been reinforced by a culture that has spent the last 500 years convincing you that your worth as a human being is measured by what you produce, the discomfort you feel when you try to rest. That isn't weakness. It's your body trying to protect you from something it learned was dangerous a long time ago. The guilt isn't a moral signal telling you that you're being lazy. It's an old alarm system that got installed before you had any say in the matter. So let's talk about where this actually comes from. Because once you understand the real origins, the pattern starts to make a different kind of sense. Not the kind of sense that makes it okay, the kind of sense that makes it possible to change. There's a phrase in psychology called parentification. It describes what happens when the natural flow of care in a family gets reversed. Instead of parents taking care of children, children end up taking care of parents. Sometimes this looks like a kid doing all the cooking and cleaning because a parent is absent or incapacitated. Sometimes it looks like a child becoming the emotional support system for a depressed mother or a volatile father. Sometimes it looks like being the one who keeps the peace, who manages everyone's feelings, who holds the family together through sheer force of responsibility. Maybe you were the one who made sure your younger siblings got to school on time. Maybe you were the one who stayed calm when everyone else was falling apart. Maybe you were the one your parent confided in about their marriage problems, or their money troubles, or their loneliness. Maybe you learned to read the room before you could read a book, scanning for signs of who needed what and how you could provide it. Researchers estimate this affects roughly 30% of young people globally, though the numbers are likely higher because this pattern often goes unrecognized. It just looks like being a good kid, a helpful kid, a mature kid. Adults would say, "You were so responsible for your age. Teachers loved you. You seem to have it together." But here's what was actually happening beneath the surface. A child in this position learns a very specific lesson about their place in the world. They learn that their value comes from what they provide. They learn that love is something you earn through usefulness. They learn that their own needs are less important than the needs of the system, and that resting or asking for care is a kind of betrayal. This isn't something a child consciously decides. It's something that gets wired in at a level below thought, and it creates adults who feel guilty when resting, who struggle to say no, who have an almost physical inability to prioritize their own needs, because at some point, a very young part of them concluded that being needed was the only way to be safe. The child learns to monitor others constantly. Are they happy? Do they need something? Is there a problem I should solve before it becomes a crisis? This vigilance becomes automatic. It becomes who you are rather than something you do. And the really cruel part is that it works. The family does rely on you. People do need you. You do hold things together. So the pattern gets reinforced over and over. You learn that when you're useful, things are stable. When you're useful, people stay. When you're useful, you matter. Taking that lesson and trying to rest with it feels like pulling out a foundation stone and hoping the house doesn't collapse. The psychologist Carl Rogers called this phenomenon conditions of worth. He was describing what happens when a child receives love that is contingent on behavior, when praise and approval only come when the child acts in ways the parent approves of, when the message, whether spoken or unspoken, is that you are acceptable only when you are being good, being helpful, being productive, being useful. This doesn't require obvious criticism or harsh punishment. Sometimes conditions of worth get transmitted through subtle signals. The slight warmth when you bring home good grades versus the neutral response to everything else. The way a parent lights up when you help, but barely notices when you're just being yourself. The endless praise for achievement and the silence around everything else. Children who grow up with conditional love develop what Rogers called incongruence. There's a gap between who they actually are and the version of themselves they've constructed to earn approval. They create internal rules, an endless list of shoulds and musts, that become the conditions under which they believe they deserve to exist. And rest violates those conditions. Rest says, I'm worthy of care simply because I exist, not because of what I produce. For someone whose entire sense of self was built on productivity, that statement feels not just wrong, but dangerous. It threatens the very foundation of their identity. If you strip away the doing, what's left? For someone with strong conditions of worth, the answer feels like nothing. The doing isn't something they add to who they are. The doing is who they are. There's another layer to this, one that family therapist Ivan Bosomenyi-Nagy explored in his work on what he called invisible loyalties. He described how children develop unconscious debts to their families, a sense that they owe something that can never quite be repaid. He noticed that some families operate on a kind of ledger system where children feel obligated to sacrifice their own needs to balance accounts they never agreed to. Maybe your parents sacrificed a lot to give you opportunities. Maybe they fled their country or worked multiple jobs or gave up their own dreams so you could have a better life. The message, even if unspoken, becomes clear. You owe us. You owe us your success. You owe us your productivity. You owe us your exhaustion in service of making their sacrifices worthwhile. This creates adults who feel perpetually indebted, who cannot rest because rest feels like defaulting on a loan, who experience any moment of self-care as a form of theft, as if they're taking something that doesn't belong to them. And none of this requires dramatic abuse or obvious dysfunction. Some of the deepest patterns come from what didn't happen rather than what did. Jonas Webb, who writes about childhood emotional neglect, describes the particular damage that occurs when parents simply fail to notice, validate, and respond to a child's emotions, not because they're cruel, but because they're distracted or overwhelmed, or were themselves raised without emotional attunement. The child learns to wall off their feelings, to act fine, to focus on others rather than themselves. This is the invisible wound, the one that doesn't leave visible scars. There's no dramatic story to tell about it. Your parents weren't abusive. They provided for you. They showed up to your games. Maybe they even said they loved you. But something was missing in how they saw you. Something was absent in how they responded to your inner world. So you learned to not have much of an inner world, or at least not to show it. You learned that your feelings weren't important enough to bring up, that your needs weren't significant enough to mention, that you could handle things on your own, had to handle things on your own, because no one was going to handle them for you. Webb calls this running on empty. These adults look functional on the outside. They often look more than functional. They look like they have it all together, but inside, there's a persistent sense that something is missing. That despite having an objectively good life, something fundamental is wrong, and one of the most common symptoms is an inability to rest. Because rest requires tuning into yourself, and tuning into yourself means encountering the emptiness you've spent your whole life outrunning. When you stop doing, you start feeling. And when you've spent years avoiding your feelings, that transition is not pleasant. It's not relaxing. It's the thing you've been protecting yourself from. The busyness isn't just habit. It's a defense. There's another pattern that develops in unstable childhood environments. It's called hypervigilance. Children raised in chaotic or emotionally volatile homes develop an exquisite sensitivity to their environment. They learn to scan constantly. Is mom's mood good today or bad? Is dad about to blow up? Oh, is this one of the safe days or one of the dangerous days? This vigilance is exhausting, but it's also useful. It helps you predict danger and avoid it. It helps you know when to be invisible and when it's safe to emerge. It helps you survive, but it doesn't turn off. Even when you grow up and leave that environment, the scanning continues. Your nervous system stays on alert. Your body keeps watching for threats that are no longer there. For these adults, rest feels like dropping your guard. And dropping your guard feels like inviting danger. The vigilance served a purpose. It kept you safe. Letting go of it, even now, even when you're safe, triggers the old warning bells. So this is where it starts. In families where love was earned rather than given, where children learned to be useful rather than to simply be, where needs were something to suppress rather than express, where the implicit message was that your worth depends on your output. But the story doesn't end in childhood. It continues into adulthood, where it takes up residence in your body. Let me explain what's actually happening in your nervous system when you try to rest and feel that wash of guilt or discomfort. Stephen Porges is a neuroscientist who developed something called Polyvagal theory. It describes how your autonomic nervous system responds to safety, danger, and life threat through 3 different pathways. The first pathway, the one that evolved most recently, is called the ventral vagal system. When this pathway is active, you feel safe, connected, grounded. Your heart rate is regulated. Your breathing is full. You can think clearly, access creativity, experience joy. This is the state where rest becomes possible, where you can sit on a couch and actually feel at peace. The second pathway is the sympathetic nervous system. This is your fight or flight response. When this activates, your heart rate speeds up. Your breathing becomes shallow. You scan for danger. You feel anxious, irritable, unable to settle. Your body is preparing to run or fight, even if there's no actual threat in the room. The third pathway is the oldest, most primitive one. It's called the dorsal vagal system. This is your shutdown response. When your nervous system decides that fighting or fleeing isn't possible, it goes into collapse. Numbness, dissociation, that feeling of being drained, like you don't have enough energy to engage with the world. Here's where this gets important for understanding rest anxiety. For people who grew up in stressful, unpredictable, or emotionally unsafe environments, the nervous system learned that stillness is dangerous, not consciously, not in words, but at the level of body memory. The nervous system developed a pattern where activity equals safety and stillness equals threat. Think about what makes sense from a survival perspective. If you grew up in a home where peace was often the calm before a storm, where a quiet house might suddenly erupt into yelling or violence or emotional chaos, where stillness didn't mean safety, it meant waiting for the other shoe to drop. Your nervous system learned that vigilance was necessary, that being on guard was smart, that the moment you relaxed was the moment you got blindsided. And it learned these lessons not through conscious thought, but through thousands of repeated experiences that wired in the message at a pre-verbal bodily level. And there's a cruel twist in how this works. For traumatized nervous systems, rest can actually trigger the shutdown pathway. the dorsal vagal response, which means that when you try to rest, your body doesn't experience it as relaxation. It experiences it as the same kind of collapse that happened during overwhelming moments in your past. Stillness feels like freeze, and freeze is associated with helplessness, with being trapped, with danger. The polyvagal therapist Deb Dana describes this with particular clarity. She says that coming safely into stillness requires the ventral vagal system, the safety and connection circuit, to be engaged and working together with the dorsal vagal system. But for many trauma survivors, that collaboration doesn't happen. Instead, stillness bypasses the safety system entirely and goes straight to shutdown. So when you try to rest, you're not actually resting. You're triggering a survival response that looks like rest from the outside, but feels like danger from the inside. You might notice that you can fall asleep fine because you're exhausted, but you don't feel restored when you wake up. Or that you can zone out watching TV, but you're not actually relaxed, just dissociated. The body is still, but the nervous system isn't safe. This is why you can know intellectually that you deserve rest, that rest is healthy, that rest is necessary, and still feel unable to do it. Because the decision about whether rest is safe is being made by parts of your brain that don't speak the language of logic. They speak the language of body sensation, of nervous system state, of implicit memory. This is also why advice like just relax or you need to take a break can feel so frustrating. You're not choosing to feel this way. Your body is making a decision before your conscious mind even gets involved. Telling someone with a dysregulated nervous system to just relax is like telling someone with a broken leg to just walk. The intent is fine. The understanding of the mechanism is completely wrong. Porges has a term for this. He calls it neuroception. It's the process by which your nervous system evaluates safety and threat without your conscious awareness. Your body is constantly scanning the environment and making judgments about whether you're safe or in danger. And if your neuroception got calibrated in an unsafe environment, it sends danger signals, even when you're actually safe. You can be sitting in your living room with nothing threatening happening, and your body can be convinced that it needs to stay vigilant. That settling down would be letting your guard down. That stillness is the moment before something bad happens. Think about what this means practically. You're trying to rest. You sit down, and your nervous system, without your permission, decides that this is suspicious. It increases your heart rate slightly. It tightens your muscles. It generates thoughts about all the things you should be doing. It manufactures guilt or anxiety or restlessness. You think you're deciding not to rest, but actually, your body has already decided for you. The thoughts and feelings that drive you off the couch are downstream of a nervous system state you didn't choose. This is why the guilt shows up. The guilt is actually a story your mind creates to explain a body state. Your nervous system is sending alarm signals, and your conscious mind needs to make sense of why you feel so uncomfortable. So it reaches for the nearest available explanation. You feel bad because you're being lazy. You feel bad because you haven't earned rest. You feel bad because you should be doing something productive. But that's not actually what's happening. What's happening is that your body is trying to protect you from what it learned was dangerous. The guilt is a cover story for a much older fear. And there's evidence for this in how the pattern actually works. The guilt isn't really connected to how much you've done. You could work 16 hours and still feel guilty resting. You could accomplish everything on your list and still feel like you haven't earned a break. Because the guilt isn't actually about today's productivity. It's about an old, unresolved sense that you're not allowed to simply be. Dan Siegel, a psychiatrist who studies the neurobiology of relationships, developed a concept called the window of tolerance. It describes the zone of arousal where you can function effectively. Within the window, you're calm but alert. You can think clearly. You can handle stress without getting overwhelmed. Above the window is hyperarousal, anxiety, panic, racing thoughts, that feeling of being too activated. Your heart races, your thoughts spiral. Everything feels urgent and you can't settle. Below the window is hyperarousal, numbness, disconnection, that foggy shutdown feeling. You're there, but not really there. Everything feels muted and far away. Trauma narrows this window significantly, where a person with a regulated nervous system might have a wide range of emotional states they can handle. A person who experienced chronic stress in childhood might have a very narrow band. Any slight shift pushes them into either hyperarousal or hypoarousal. Rest requires staying in the window, and for someone with a narrow window, that's incredibly difficult. The moment they stop moving, stop doing, stop distracting themselves, their arousal level shifts, and they find themselves either anxious or numb. Neither state feels like rest. Both feel like something is wrong. The anxious version looks like that itch to be productive, the restless energy, the mind spinning with tasks, the inability to settle. You try to rest, but your body says no, this isn't right. You need to be doing something. The numb version looks like dissociation. You zone out. You scroll your phone for hours without really seeing anything. You rest, but you don't feel rested because you weren't really present. You escaped, but you didn't recover. So they keep moving. They keep the to-do list going. They fill every quiet moment with activity, not because they love being busy, but because being busy is the only way their nervous system knows how to stay regulated. Activity keeps them in that narrow window where they can function. Think of it like walking a tightrope. As long as you're moving, you can maintain balance. The moment you stop, you start to wobble. So you keep moving, always moving, because stopping feels like falling. Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote The Body Keeps the Score, has spent decades studying how trauma lives in the body. He makes a point that's essential for understanding why insight isn't enough. He says that traumatized people are terrified of what is going on inside of them. Stillness forces attention inward, and for someone whose inner world is filled with unfelt feelings, unprocessed experiences, and a nervous system stuck in survival mode, that inward turn is not peaceful. It's overwhelming. There might be grief in there that you've never had time to feel. There might be anger that was never safe to express. There might be loneliness so vast that you've kept it at bay your whole life by staying busy. There might be an emptiness that you've been running from since childhood. The sense that there's something fundamentally wrong with you, something missing at the core. Rest brings you face to face with all of that. Is it any wonder that your body fights against it? Van der Kolk also talks about how trauma creates what he calls a chronic state of threat arousal. Your body acts as if danger is always imminent, even when you're safe. Your stress hormones stay elevated. Your muscles stay tense. Your nervous system stays primed for action. In this state, your body isn't interested in rest. Rest is what you do when the threat has passed. But for your body, the threat hasn't passed. The threat is always there, invisible, but ever present. And as long as the threat exists, your body will keep you ready to respond to it. Activity becomes a regulation strategy. As long as you're moving, checking boxes, accomplishing things, you don't have to feel what's underneath. The moment you stop, the feelings you've been outrunning catch up. This shows up in 100 different ways in daily life. You can't just watch a movie. You have to be doing something else at the same time. Scrolling your phone, folding laundry, meal planning. Pure entertainment feels wasteful. You can't take a vacation without cramming it full of activities, itineraries, sightseeing schedules. The idea of just sitting on a beach doing nothing sounds like torture, not relaxation. You come back from trips more exhausted than when you left. You struggle to be present with people because your mind is always tracking what you should be doing next. Even in good moments, enjoyable moments, a part of you is calculating the opportunity cost of not being productive right now. You might have trouble sleeping, not because you're not tired, but because nighttime is the only time left for yourself. So you stay up too late doing things you don't even particularly enjoy just because they feel like a choice you made rather than an obligation. Or maybe you fall asleep easily because you're exhausted, but you wake up anxious at 4 in the morning with your mind already racing through the day's tasks. Your relationships show the pattern too. You have trouble just being with people. You want to be helping them, fixing things for them, making yourself useful. When someone says they just want your company, a part of you doesn't believe them. Surely they need something. Surely you should be doing something for them. Receiving care feels uncomfortable. When someone offers to help you, your first instinct is to refuse. You insist you're fine. You don't want to be a burden. You'd rather exhaust yourself than owe anyone anything. And when you're struggling, when you're overwhelmed or sad or burned out, you don't reach out. You push harder. You try to work your way through it. Because asking for help feels like failing. Because needing support feels like weakness. Because being taken care of feels deeply unfamiliar and therefore suspect. You might even feel a strange emptiness when there's nothing to do. Like you don't know who you are without a task. Like the person who exists outside of productivity is someone you haven't met yet, or someone you met once and can't quite remember. Some people in this pattern become high achievers. They accomplish impressive things because they can't stop working. But the achievement doesn't feel good. It feels like relief, briefly, and then the pressure builds again. The goalpost moves. The next milestone appears. There's always more you could be doing. Others in this pattern burn out repeatedly. They push until they collapse, recover just enough to function, and then start pushing again. They oscillate between frantic productivity and forced rest, never finding a sustainable middle ground. And some people just feel constantly behind. No matter how much they do, they never feel caught up. They never feel like they've done enough to earn rest. They live with a chronic, low-grade sense of failure, even when they're objectively doing fine. Peter Levine, who who developed somatic experiencing as a trauma treatment, noticed something interesting about animals in the wild. They're constantly under threat from predators, yet they don't seem to develop the same kind of stuck trauma that humans do. He observed that after escaping a threat, animals literally shake off the survival energy. They tremor, they move, they complete the defensive response that got interrupted by the freeze. Humans don't do this. We often stay frozen. The energy that was prepared for fight or flight remains trapped in the body, and from the body's perspective, it's still under threat. This is why rest feels dangerous. Your body never got the message that the threat is over. It's still bracing for something that already happened. And now, let's add another layer. Because your developmental history and your nervous system don't exist in a vacuum. They exist in a culture that has spent centuries validating the inability to rest. In the early 1500s, a religious movement was sweeping through Europe that would reshape how Western civilization thinks about work. The Protestant Reformation, particularly its Calvinist branch, introduced a set of beliefs that still govern our psychology today, even for people who have never set foot in a church. Calvinists believed in predestination. God had already decided who would be saved and who would be damned, and there was nothing you could do to change it. This created what the sociologist Max Weber described as unprecedented inner loneliness and profound salvation anxiety. Believers desperately wanted to know if they were among the elect, but they had no way to find out. The solution they developed was to look for signs. If you were blessed by God, surely your life would show evidence of that blessing. Success in your work, your calling, became proof that you might be saved. And conversely, idleness, rest, enjoyment, these began to look like signs of damnation. Weber wrote about this in The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. His observation still haunts us. He said that the Puritan wanted to work in a calling, but we are forced to do so. What began as religious devotion became economic necessity wrapped in moral language. The framework has secularized, but its grip on our psychology remains. We inherited a belief system that equates work with virtue and rest with sin, and we absorbed it so completely that it doesn't feel like a belief at all. It feels like reality. It feels like just the way things are. Then capitalism took this religious framework and ran with it. If your worth is measured by what you produce, then every hour not spent producing is an hour of lost value. Time became money. Rest became theft. Not from an employer, but from yourself, from your future, from your potential. The language of business crept into personal life. We talk about investing in ourselves, about maximizing our potential, about being productive, about having something to show for our time. Even our leisure has become a performance metric. Are you relaxing in an optimized way? Are you using your rest to become more productive later? And then social media arrived and turned productivity into performance. Now we don't just have to be productive. We have to be seen being productive. We compare ourselves not to our neighbors, but to curated highlight reels of people who appear to be accomplishing more, sleeping less, optimizing every moment. There's always someone on the internet who woke up earlier than you, someone who read more books this year, someone who started a business while raising twins, while training for a marathon. The comparison never ends, and you always come up short. The rise of hustle culture made workaholism not just acceptable, but aspirational. Sleep when you're dead. Grind now. Rest later. Your dreams don't work unless you do. Inspirational quotes designed to make exhaustion sound noble. A generation of people are burning out, not because they're weak, but because they've been handed an impossible equation. The researcher Christina Maslach, who developed the primary measurement tool for burnout, has found that over half of workers report feeling burned out. 77% have experienced burnout at their jobs, and the drivers aren't personal failing. Their workload, lack of control, insufficient rewards, isolation, inequity, and misalignment between personal values and job demands. The culture says the problem is that you're not working smart enough, or that you don't have good boundaries, or that you need better productivity systems. Rarely does the culture acknowledge that maybe the expectation is insane, that maybe constant productivity isn't a sustainable human state, that maybe rest is a biological need, not a reward for good behavior. Devon Price, a social psychologist, argues that what we call laziness doesn't actually exist. He says that if someone's behavior doesn't make sense to you, it's because you're missing part of their context. What looks like laziness is usually exhaustion, burnout, overwhelm, or a body desperately trying to get the rest it needs in a culture that punishes rest. Price identified 3 core beliefs that make up what he calls the laziness lie. First, your worth is your productivity. Second, there is always more you could be doing. Third, you cannot trust your own needs and limitations. If you absorb those beliefs early, if they got layered on top of a childhood where love was conditional and a nervous system that was trained to stay vigilant, then of course, you can't rest. You've been surrounded by messaging your entire life that tells you rest is failure. And here's the insidious part. The culture doesn't just tell you that you should be productive. It tells you that wanting to rest is a moral failing, that needing rest means you're not tough enough, not dedicated enough, not worthy enough. So you don't just feel unable to rest. You feel bad about wanting to rest. You feel guilty that rest sounds appealing. You feel like there's something wrong with you for not being able to go like everyone else seems to be doing. Except they're not doing it either. They're also exhausted. They're also burning out. They're also lying awake at night wondering if they're falling behind. We're all pretending to be fine while slowly drowning. So now we have the full picture. Developmental patterns that taught your worth depends on usefulness. A nervous system that learned stillness equals danger. And a culture that validates and rewards the inability to rest. 3 forces working together to make something as basic as sitting still feel impossible. But here's what I need you to understand now. Everything I've just described, the early learning, the nervous system patterns, the cultural programming, none of it is permanent. None of it is who you are. It's what happened to you and what you learned. And what was learned can be unlearned. The science here is clear. Your brain has something called neuroplasticity. It can change. It can form new neural pathways throughout your entire life. The patterns that got wired in during childhood are not fixed. They're more like well-worn paths through a forest. You've walked them so many times that they feel like the only way to go. But new paths can be carved. Brain imaging studies show that when we change how we respond to situations, When we learn new ways to think and feel, our brains physically rewire themselves. The areas that were overactive can calm down. The connections that were weak can strengthen. This isn't wishful thinking. It's documented neuroscience. And there's a concept in attachment research that offers particular hope. It's called earned secure attachment. This is the classification given to adults who experienced insecure parenting in childhood, but have developed secure relationship patterns as adults. Daniel Siegel, whose work bridges neurobiology and attachment, has found that the best predictor of a child's security of attachment is not what happened to their parents as children, but how their parents made sense of those experiences. Meaning, creating a coherent narrative of your own history is itself transformative. You don't have to have had a perfect childhood to develop secure attachment. You can earn it through therapy, through relationships with people who offer consistent care, through the slow work of making sense of your story. But here's where it gets complicated. Understanding why you can't rest doesn't automatically enable you to rest. If insight were enough, everyone who read a self-help book would be transformed. Clearly, that's not how it works. The reason is that trauma doesn't live in the thinking part of your brain. It lives in the body. It lives in the parts of the brain that process sensation, emotion, implicit memory. These parts don't respond to logic. They respond to experience. Pete Walker, who writes about complex trauma, observes that many trauma survivors learned early in life to manage painful feelings by staying busy with distracting activities. He notes that flight types can devolve into workaholism and what he calls busyholism. Understanding this pattern intellectually doesn't stop the cascade. The nervous system has to learn what the mind already knows. This is why there are different approaches to healing and why the body-based ones matter so much for this particular issue. Top-down approaches work with the thinking brain. Cognitive therapy, talk therapy, analyzing patterns and replacing thoughts. These can be helpful. They give you frameworks, language, ways of understanding what's happening. Bottom-up approaches work with the body. Somatic experiencing, EMDR, yoga, breathwork. These engage the nervous system directly, helping to discharge trapped survival energy, expand the window of tolerance, and teach the body that stillness can be safe. Both matter. But for rest anxiety specifically, the body-based work is often essential because you're trying to change a body pattern, not just a thought pattern. Peter Levine developed a concept called titration that's crucial here. It means working with difficult material in small doses rather than all at once. For someone learning to rest, this might mean starting with 5 minutes of intentional stillness. Not an hour, not even 30 minutes, just 5. The nervous system gets overwhelmed when you try to change too much too fast. It goes into protection mode, but small doses, repeated consistently, can gradually expand capacity. You're not trying to force yourself into rest. You're slowly teaching your body that small amounts of stillness won't destroy you. Levine also talks about pendulation, the natural rhythm between states of expansion and contraction. A healthy nervous system can move between activation and rest without getting stuck. Part of healing is restoring that natural pendulation, learning to move into activation and then come back down rather than staying stuck in one state. There's a therapy called internal family systems that offers a different framework, and it's particularly useful for the guilt piece of rest anxiety. Richard Schwartz, who developed this approach, proposes that we all have different parts of ourselves. Some parts carry pain from the past. Some parts work to prevent that pain from being triggered, often through things like perfectionism or workaholism. Some parts react when the pain does get triggered through numbing behaviors or dissociation. The part of you that can't rest has a protective function. It learned that productivity kept you safe, kept you loved, kept you valuable. From its perspective, it's been doing an important job your whole life. It watched what happened when you weren't useful. Maybe you were criticized. Maybe you were ignored. Maybe love was withdrawn. So it took over. It made sure you would always be doing something, always be proving your worth, always be protected from that old danger. This part doesn't know that things have changed. It doesn't know that you're an adult now, with more options. It doesn't know that there are people who will love you even when you're not producing. It's still operating from the old rules, the childhood rules, because no one ever told it those rules don't apply anymore. The IFS approach doesn't try to override this part or defeat it. Instead, it treats the part with curiosity and compassion. What is it afraid will happen if you rest? What is it trying to protect you from? When did it first take on this job? What does it need to know to feel safe enough to relax? Schwartz says there are no bad parts. Even the most destructive seeming patterns have an underlying protective intention. Healing means thanking the part for its service and helping it find a new role. Not forcing it to stop, but showing it that the danger it was guarding against is no longer present in the same way. This is different from just telling yourself to relax. It's an internal relationship. It's making contact with a young, frightened part of you that learned rest was dangerous and letting it know that things have changed. It's showing that part evidence. Here, look, I rested yesterday and nothing bad happened. I took a day off and my partner still loves me. I sat still for 10 minutes and the world didn't fall apart. Over time, the part learns that its vigilance isn't as necessary as it once was. It doesn't disappear entirely. It might always be there, ready to spring into action if needed, but it relaxes. It allows for more space. It lets other possibilities in. Self-compassion research, pioneered by Kristin Neff, shows that treating yourself with kindness rather than criticism is strongly associated with psychological well-being. And contrary to what you might expect, self-compassion doesn't undermine motivation. It actually supports it. People who are kind to themselves are more resilient, more willing to try again after failure, more able to make changes. The fear many people have is that if they're compassionate with themselves, they'll become lazy, that the harsh inner critic is the only thing keeping them productive, that if they let up on the self-judgment, they'll sink into a couch and never get up again. But research shows the opposite. The inner critic doesn't actually motivate productive behavior. It motivates avoidance, perfectionism, and burnout. People who are harsh with themselves aren't more productive than people who are kind to themselves. They're just more miserable. Neff defines self-compassion as having 3 components: self-kindness rather than self-judgment, recognition of common humanity, that suffering is part of the shared human experience, and mindfulness, the ability to observe painful feelings without being consumed by them. For someone who can't rest without guilt, self-compassion means meeting that guilt with kindness instead of more criticism. It means recognizing that millions of people struggle with this same pattern, that you're not uniquely flawed. It means being able to notice the discomfort of stillness without being swept away by it. Nev says something I find beautiful. She says the goal of practice is simply to be a compassionate mess. We're going to get it wrong. We're going to make mistakes. But if our goal is to be compassionate with that mess, then in a way, we've already achieved our goal. Gabor Mate, whose work on trauma and addiction has helped millions, developed an approach called compassionate inquiry. At its heart is a simple question. Where did I learn this? Where did I learn that my worth is based on my productivity? Where did I learn that rest is dangerous? Where did I learn that I don't deserve care unless I have earned it? The question isn't accusatory. It's curious. It's asking you to trace the thread back to its origin. Not so you can blame anyone, but so you can understand. Mate talks about how we develop adaptations in childhood that make sense given our circumstances. If you grew up in a family where productivity was valued and rest was criticized, becoming a constant doer was an intelligent adaptation. It helped you survive. It got you the approval you needed. The problem is that these adaptations outlive their usefulness. You're not in that family anymore. You're not that child anymore. But the adaptation is still running, like software that hasn't been updated in 20 years. It doesn't know that the operating environment has changed. The answer always traces back somewhere, to a parent who only noticed you when you were helping, to a household where stillness meant someone might start yelling, to a school where your worth was measured by grades and achievements, to a culture that told you successful people hustle, to a body that learned to equate vigilance with survival. Once you can see where it came from, the pattern loosens its grip. Not all at once, not magically, but it becomes possible to respond differently, to notice the guilt arising and say, yes, I know why you're here, and I'm going to rest anyway, to see the urge to be productive and recognize it as an old survival strategy rather than current reality. There's power in naming things. When you understand that the guilt isn't a moral signal, but a trauma response, it changes how you relate to it. You stop treating it as truth and start treating it as information. Oh, my nervous system is activated. Oh, my inner child is scared. Oh, my protective part is doing its job. Okay, now what do I want to do about that? There's something I want to say about people who can rest without guilt. Because understanding what they have that you might not can be illuminating. You've probably seen them. They can lounge around on a Sunday without that constant nagging feeling that they should be doing something. They can take a sick day without spending it anxious about falling behind. They can go on vacation and actually relax instead of returning more exhausted than when they left. And maybe you've wondered what's wrong with you that you can't do that. Maybe you've assumed they're less ambitious, less responsible, less conscientious. Maybe you've told yourself that your inability to rest is actually a virtue, a sign that you care more, work harder, want it more. But that's not what's going on. The difference isn't about caring, it's about conditioning. Someone who can rest without guilt usually had a different early experience. They had what Donald Winnicott called good enough parenting. Not perfect parenting, but parenting that was attuned and responsive often enough. Research suggests that about 30% attunement is sufficient for secure attachment. Parents don't have to be perfect. They have to repair when they rupture. These children internalized a different belief about their worth. They learned that they were valuable simply for existing, not for what they produced. They got the message, spoken or unspoken, that they were lovable just as they were, that they didn't have to earn their place in the family. The psychologist John Bowlby described this through internal working models. Someone with secure attachment has an internal working model that says, "I am worthy of care. Others can be relied upon. The world is generally safe." When this person sits down to rest, nothing threatens their sense of self. They don't feel like they have to justify existing through productivity. Their nervous systems also got calibrated differently. They learn that the world is generally safe. Their bodies can shift into rest and digest mode without setting off alarm bells. Stillness feels like settling rather than shutdown. Quiet feels like peace rather than the moment before something bad happens. When they get tired, they rest. When they're depleted, they take a break. They don't push through exhaustion as a badge of honor. They take care of themselves like it's a normal thing to do. And their rest actually restores them because they can actually settle into it. This isn't about being less driven or less ambitious. Some of the most accomplished people have secure attachment and can rest without guilt. The difference is they don't need constant productivity to feel worthy. They work because they want to, not because they'll cease to exist if they stop. And here's the crucial point. You can develop these capacities even if you didn't have them early on. Earned secure attachment is real. People do it all the time. The brain that learned one thing can learn another. What does this actually look like in practice? It looks like starting small. 5 minutes of intentional rest. Not an hour of trying to relax while your body screams at you to do something. Just 5 minutes of sitting still and noticing what happens. You might notice that your heart rate increases slightly, that your jaw clenches, that your mind starts generating urgent-seeming thoughts about tasks you've forgotten. That's okay. That's not failure. That's information. That's your nervous system doing what it learned to do. You're not trying to stop those reactions. You're just learning to be present with them without immediately acting on them. It looks like letting the discomfort be there without reaching for your phone or your to-do list. The discomfort is the old programming running. It feels urgent, but it's not actually urgent. Sitting with it for 5 minutes won't break you, and gradually, session by session, day by day, the discomfort starts to soften. It looks like working with the body, not against it. Finding practices that help regulate your nervous system. This might be breathing exercises, slow exhales that activate the parasympathetic nervous system. It might be movement, yoga, or walking or dancing, things that help discharge stored survival energy. It might be time in nature, where the nervous system naturally tends to regulate. It might be cold exposure, or humming, or shaking, or any of the dozens of practices that work with the body's natural capacity to shift states. The specific practice matters less than finding what works for your particular system. Some people regulate through stillness. Others need movement first before they can settle. Some people do better alone. Others need co-regulation, the calming presence of another person. This is not one size fits all. It's about learning your own nervous system and what it needs. It looks like creating what psychologists call corrective experiences. These are new experiences that contradict the old learning. Relationships where you're valued for who you are, not what you do. Moments where you express a need and someone responds with care instead of criticism. Times where you rest and nothing bad happens. Every time you rest and the world doesn't fall apart, your brain updates its predictions slightly. Every time someone cares for you without you having to earn it, your internal working model shifts a little. These experiences accumulate over time. They don't erase the old programming overnight, but they create new neural pathways alongside the old ones. Eventually, the new pathways become accessible enough that they're actually usable. It looks like therapy, possibly, not because there's something wrong with you, but because having a consistent, safe, attuned relationship with someone is one of the most reliable ways to develop earned, secure attachment. A good therapist provides what you might not have gotten early on. They see you. They don't require you to be useful. They stay present even when you're struggling. That consistency rewires the brain. For body-based issues like rest anxiety, somatic therapies can be particularly helpful. Somatic experiencing, which helps discharge trapped survival energy. EMDR, which can process stuck trauma. Sensorimotor psychotherapy, which works directly with the body's patterns. These approaches work at the level where the problem actually lives, which is the nervous system and the body, not just the conscious mind. It looks like developing self-compassion. When the guilt arises, instead of adding another layer of guilt on top of it, you meet it with kindness. Oh, that guilt again. I know you. I know where you came from. I know you're trying to protect me. But I'm going to rest anyway, and I'm going to be kind to myself while I do it. This might feel fake at first. If you've been harsh with yourself your whole life, self-compassion can feel uncomfortable or even wrong. That's okay. Do it anyway. The research shows that self-compassion is a skill that develops with practice. You don't have to feel compassionate to act compassionately toward yourself. Eventually, the feeling catches up. It looks like making meaning of your story, understanding where the pattern came from without staying stuck in blame. Your parents probably did the best they could with what they had. The culture isn't evil, just misguided. You learned what you learned because it made sense at the time. And now you can learn something new. Daniel Siegel's research shows that creating a coherent narrative of your past is itself healing. Being able to tell your story, to understand how you got here, to connect the dots between then and now, changes how the past lives in you. The experiences don't disappear, but they become integrated instead of dissociated. They become something you have rather than something that has you. It looks like patience, so much patience, because you're trying to change something that's been wired in for decades. The nervous system is not known for rapid transformation. It's known for slow, incremental change, for 2 steps forward and 1 step back. For plateaus that last longer than you'd like, there will be days when the guilt wins, when you can't settle no matter how hard you try, when you end up doing the laundry even though you promised yourself you'd rest. That's part of the process. That's not failure. The old patterns are strong. They've kept you alive this long. They're not going to surrender without resistance. And it looks like celebration of small wins. You sat still for 5 minutes, and only checked your phone twice. That's progress. You went on vacation and had 2 actual hours of feeling relaxed. That's progress. You noticed the guilt arising and didn't immediately obey it. That's progress. The goal isn't perfection. The goal isn't becoming someone who never feels guilt about resting. That's not realistic for someone with your history. The goal is widening the space between the trigger and the response, building a little more capacity to choose, having rest be an option, not just a theory. Pete Walker, writing about recovery from complex trauma, lists signs that healing is happening. One of them is a gradual increase in the ability to relax. Notice the word gradual. This isn't about forcing transformation. It's about allowing it to unfold, one small experience at a time. He also lists other signs: a reduction in the frequency and intensity of flashbacks, a shrinking inner critic, an increased ability to be present with your own feelings, an increased ability to ask for help and receive care, a growing sense that you're okay, that you're enough, that you belong here. These things don't happen all at once. They don't happen in order. They come and go. You might feel real progress for weeks and then have a setback that makes you wonder if you've changed at all. That's normal. That's what rewiring looks like. It's not linear, but underneath the ups and downs, something is shifting. The old patterns are loosening. The new patterns are strengthening. The body is slowly learning what the mind has always known. I want to say something about what it feels like when the shift starts to happen, because knowing what you're aiming for can help you recognize it when it comes. It starts with moments, just moments at first. You're sitting somewhere and you realize you haven't thought about what you should be doing for a few minutes. You weren't relaxed exactly, but you weren't stressed either. You were just existing, and it didn't feel wrong. Or you're tired, genuinely tired, and instead of pushing through like you always do, you decide to lie down, and you feel a little guilt, but you do it anyway, and nothing bad happens. The world doesn't end. You rest for 20 minutes, and then you get up, and the tasks are still there, waiting patiently, and somehow they don't seem as urgent as they did before. Or someone takes care of you. Maybe you're sick and a partner or friend brings you soup and tells you to stay in bed. And instead of protesting, instead of insisting you're fine, instead of getting up to do things anyway, you just say thank you. You just receive it. And underneath the strangeness of being cared for, there's something else, something warm, something that feels like it's been missing for a very long time. These moments accumulate. They start to connect. The gaps between them get shorter. And one day, you realize that rest doesn't feel quite so dangerous anymore. It still feels unfamiliar, maybe. You might never be someone who naturally lounges around doing nothing. But the guilt has softened. The urgency has diminished. The voice saying you don't deserve rest has gotten quieter. And maybe, eventually, you discover something underneath all that productivity. A person you haven't spent much time with. The person you are when you're not doing anything. When you're not earning, not achieving, not proving anything. That person might be interesting. That person might have thoughts and feelings that have been waiting a long time to be noticed. That person might actually be someone worth getting to know. I want to return to where we started. You on the couch, feeling like something is wrong because nothing is wrong. That itch to be productive. That voice saying, you don't deserve this. Now you know where that comes from. It comes from a child who learned their worth depended on usefulness. It comes from a nervous system that got calibrated for vigilance. It comes from a culture that turned rest into sin and productivity into virtue. And now you also know that it can change. Not easily, not quickly, but genuinely. The brain can rewire. The nervous system can recalibrate. The internal working model can update. People earn secure attachment every day. They learn to rest without guilt. They sit on their couches and feel at peace. The path forward isn't about forcing yourself to relax through willpower. That doesn't work. The nervous system doesn't take orders from the conscious mind. The path forward is about creating the conditions where rest becomes possible. Safety in the body, kindness toward the parts that resist, small experiments with stillness, relationships that don't require you to earn your worth. It's about learning, slowly, that you can stop, that nothing terrible will happen, that you won't become lazy or worthless. That rest is not a reward for productivity, but a basic human need that you're allowed to meet, not because you've earned it, but because you exist. The guilt might not disappear entirely, but it can soften. It can become quieter. It can shift from a command to a relic, a voice from the past that you can hear without obeying. You can notice it arising and think, "Oh, that old thing," instead of believing it means you're doing something wrong. You might even develop a strange affection for the part of you that couldn't rest. It worked so hard for so long. It kept you going when you were too young to know any other way. It did what it could with the information it had, and now you can thank it and let it know that things have changed, and gently take the reins yourself. There's a life on the other side of this pattern. A life where you can work hard when you choose to and rest when you need to, where your sense of self doesn't depend on constant achievement, where you can be present with people without scanning for ways to make yourself useful, where a free evening feels like a gift rather than a test you're failing. That life is possible, not as some idealized fantasy, but as a realistic outcome of slow, patient, consistent work. People do this every day. They heal old wounds. They rewire old patterns. They become people they weren't sure they could be. And eventually, maybe, you'll sit down on a free evening with nothing on the calendar, and instead of the guilt and the itch and the mental to-do list, you'll feel something else. You'll feel rest, real rest, the kind that actually restores you, the kind that leaves you better than it found you, the kind that feels like coming home to yourself. Not because you finally did enough, not because you finally earned it, but because your body finally learned what your mind has always known. That stillness is not dangerous, that peace is not a betrayal, that you were always worthy of care. That's not a destination you arrive at. It's a direction you move toward, one moment at a time, one 5-minute experiment, one self-compassionate thought, one relationship where you don't have to perform, one rest that doesn't end in disaster. And every small step counts, every time you choose rest over guilt. Even if the guilt still shows up, you're carving a new path through that forest. You're teaching your nervous system that the world is different now. You're proving to yourself that you can change. You're not broken for struggling with this. You're human. You learned what you learned because it was necessary. You survived. And now you can learn something new. You can learn that surviving isn't the same as living, that that you're allowed to live, that you're allowed to rest. Maybe start tonight. 5 minutes. Sit somewhere comfortable. Notice the discomfort without acting on it. Notice the guilt without believing it. Just be there, just for 5 minutes, existing without earning the right to exist. See what happens. Not because you have to, because you're allowed to. You've always been allowed to.